Hello, everyone. In this video, I'll be talking about strategic family counseling as well as solution-focused brief counseling, and obviously applied to family, couple, and systems counseling. I'll be, as usual, drawing from the Gladding text, the family therapy text, 7th edition, as well as some of the thoughts of some of the major authors and founders of these approaches. All right, so I'm going to start with the strategic family counseling approach. There's various schools of thought in this approach, so I'll be kind of talking about just some of the general principles, though, that are pretty common among these approaches. So the core idea behind the strategic approach is that it's very change and action focused. So insight isn't really the goal here. It's not insight into the dynamics, the history of the family unit. So, the having an idea of the intergenerational patterns, that's not really emphasized. It's just like, where are you at right now? Where do you want to go? How do you want to behave differently? How do you want to change? So developing strategies for change and addressing unique problems is the key. It's seen as a brief approach, so a lot of times not really needed according to this approach. Once again, I think a lot of it has to do with, it's just what is the presenting problem and how do we resolve that presenting problem, period. Without need for historical or big insights to occur. So it's really important in this approach that, the emphasis is on clarity, getting really detail oriented about what is the problem. So clearly defining the problem, getting examples of the problem, seeing how it surfaces, what are the nuances, the specific details, and exploring past ways of resolving the issue. Maybe some of those past ways have worked, and maybe they're just not being utilized anymore. Then, you kind of construct with the family, finding a clear pathway forward, an action plan forward. And once again, I use the word clear. I keep using that because, the specifics are very important, getting specific about, how do we move about change? I think that's really where the strategic word in this theory, in this approach is really important is, how can we develop a clear strategy to move forward? So obviously it's very goal-directed, problem resolution focused, so the goal is how can we recognize the problem and resolve it. So some of the techniques that are used in this approach, reframing, I think this almost borders just a core counseling skill at this point, because a lot of theories utilize kind of this idea of helping clients reframe or re-perceive how they see their issue. But yeah, reframing, kind of helping the family gain a new vantage point. But there's also the use of directives. And so Gladding in his text talks about, the use of directives in this approach. It's not imposing values. It's not a value directive. Like, here's what you should believe. Here's how you should move forward in your life in a general way or from a value position. So it's not like saying, here's the values of the counselor and I'll oppose them. It's more into the nuances and the specific change plan. So if for example, if a client was having, and Gladding gave this example, if someone was struggling to sleep, the counselor might say, when you're struggling to sleep, try to stay awake as long as possible. Try to stay awake all night. So that's kind of like behavioral oriented directive. And Madonna's talked about one of the key figures in this approach, that the directive is to strategic therapy as the interpretation is to psychoanalysis. And that's in the Gladding text on page 314. But yeah, interpretation is central to psychoanalysis, and Madonna's is saying directive is central to strategic therapy. So let's go on to another technique of paradox. The paradox is used in various approaches, but the idea is, I guess one way that this is utilized in the strategic approach is to prescribe the symptom. So prescribing the symptom could just basically say, kind of keep doing what you're doing. You're doing fine. Keep doing what you're doing. It sounds odd, like they came in to change, and this is a change-oriented approach. But the belief system behind this is if the counselor can kind of give permission for the family to keep doing what they're doing, it almost like relieves the tension, or relieves the belief system is that then the family will self-correct, because like the counselor's not going to force them, they're not going to tell them, so we have to kind of figure it out. So it's almost a way of kind of honoring their autonomy. even me saying it though, I don't use personally paradox. I don't exactly see how it works. Like I have kind of confusion around that. But in the end, Glading has talked about that it's used with caution. It's used with being really thoughtful. And one example of, Jim Coyne is a figure in this approach, in the strategic approach. And he basically just encouraged the family in one of his demonstrations to say, just notice your problems. If you notice the problems, that's a good thing. That's the goal. We're just going to focus on noticing it this week. So instead of like being upset about the problem occurring again, it was almost like a victory. Okay, here it is. Now I got to notice it, notice the details, and bring it back to the counseling experience. So, his approach almost seemed to say that, it's freeing, that it's, the problem occurring isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's freeing that it's just, there it is. It's almost like this idea of acceptance. Okay, ordeals. So an ordeal has to do with almost like a distraction from engaging in the troublesome behavior. So one of the examples from Glading that's given is like, so if the client family knows that they're about to get into an argument, then they have, one of the members has to go shower first. So that would be the ordeal, is like, okay, kind of adding in a behavior that's not necessarily a negative behavior, but it's almost like, I don't really want to go do it right now. It's almost like an added burden. So in order to get to the challenge and the argument, I have to do this thing first. So it's, I think a way of just kind of sparking a new element into that circular causal pattern to hopefully disrupt it. And let's see here, a couple more examples. So positioning. So positioning it's kind of like a motivational interviewing principle, actually, or motivational interviewing, maybe borrowed it from strategic, but it's this idea of accepting and exaggerating behaviors. So it could be just like saying, if someone is maybe slightly irritated, saying you're super angry about that. So it's almost like accepting, yep, you feel really angry about that, but the client's like, no, not really. It's a little irritation is all. But if that irritation is leading them to then fight, in a big way, the idea is that it kind of acknowledges that, okay, so you're saying that there's just a slight irritation, but then the behaviors are way more escalated than that. So it can help acknowledge and help the client see that, they're responding in a bigger way than what maybe is necessary. Exception finding is an important part of this approach as well. So it's this idea of, when is the problem not there? Or if you often struggle with this issue, when don't you struggle with it? So that exception can be a way to find problem resolution or a pathway, an action plan forward. So some of the techniques that are specific to the Milan approach, the systemic family counseling theory, which is, an offshoot or connected back to strategic, is hypothesizing. So it's almost like a team would get together and they would kind of hypothesize together what's going on with the family. So this team approach was utilized to really kind of conceptualize and make sense of the family. So that's one, technique that's kind of unique. Lots of questions would be asked, and circular questions, kind of eliciting the various perceptions of different members of the family about, specific behaviors that are going on. And one thought of an invariant prescription is kind of an unique idea that I hadn't heard of, from a lot of different approaches. I think it's pretty unique to specifically Milan. But so this idea of an invariant prescription is like introducing like some sort of secret. Maybe the parents or the caregivers would say that they have a secret, but they won't tell the children what it is. So the children know that there's a secret. But so it's almost like, to me, honestly, it kind of sounds manipulative a little bit, but the intention, what Glading talked about, is that it's like basically bringing power back into the parents' hands. It directs attention to the secret rather than maybe some of the family dynamics. So maybe it's a form of distraction, but it's also an opportunity, apparently, kind of an experiential opportunity to create a situation or an opportunity to make sense of how different family members respond to this secret that they can't find out about. Once again, my reaction, never used it myself, but I think the idea is that it kind of sparks new power positions in the family, as well as just new opportunities to observe. I think those are some of the, key key differences in this approach, or key techniques. So just to kind of wrap up with, for strategic, is the role of the counselor is kind of, from my perception and experience, is like to be the expert, kind of, but also to be almost like a director. I'm almost thinking like an orchestra, like they're directing, how does this change occur? But, the family still needs to be implementing those changes, being the doers. The counselor's pretty active. According to the Milan approach, that the counsel, it's important that the counselor's neutral. And I kind of see that as also like a co-creator with the family. And, the role of the counselor is really to get down to business quickly, because they're not there to waste time. They're not there to focus on overarching large insights and awareness. It's like, what's the problem? Let's resolve it. I kind of see it like a quick pounce to the issues. And I think maybe there's some advantages to that, but maybe there's also maybe they jump too quickly to an issue when there's bigger issues kind of circling. But that's obviously based on my bias. All right, so solution focused brief, this approach. All right, some of the core constructs of this model is it's based in postmodernism and constructivism. So basically there's this idea that there is no truth, there is no capital T truth, that each individual creates their worldview, creates their view, or they're socially influenced by culture, by context, by the messaging from family, to like how to view themselves. So that becomes important, because the use of language and how we interpret, how we construct ourselves and our perceptions, our beliefs, our actions becomes really central to this approach. So the idea is that if we can change the way that we construct ourselves, and if we can change what we choose to focus on as we're constructing ourselves, then we can change our behaviors and our feelings and our reactions. So it's not problem saturated. I think that's where it's very different than the strategic approach. Is the emphasis isn't on like really clearly understanding the problem. So for example, where's the quote? So in the Gladding text on page 336, Trepper is quoted on this, but in the Gladding text, it says, although the causes of problems may be complex, their solutions need not necessarily be. So there's just this belief that, maybe we don't have to get into all the problem. Maybe the problem's not even important. Maybe just focusing on solutions of ways of moving forward can be emphasized. So sometimes it might be, I've sometimes experienced it as like, okay, we're not addressing the issues. We're not addressing the problematic behavior or the issues or the challenges, but the solution-focused counselor would say, yeah, because if we choose to construct ourselves based on saturating ourselves in the problems, then we'll get stuck in the problems. So that's where that lens of postmodernism, social constructionism really comes in. It's like, if we're going to construct ourselves in a new way, we need to choose what are we going to construct ourselves around. So they're choosing to emphasize solutions. So once again, detailed history is not needed. Insight's not really emphasized. Change is emphasized. And there's this belief that small changes, even just like really nuanced changes, lead to larger changes down the road. So Insoo Berg is a big name in the solution-focused approach. And she would often, kind of one of her end of the session techniques that she would use. And I guess I'm going to shift really quick and address something by O'Hanlon. So Bill O'Hanlon's another big name. He talked about, he called solution-focused possibility theory instead, or possibility therapy. So he's focused on like, what are the new possibilities? So how can I change? He talked about changing the viewing. How can I change how I view things? How can I change what I do? How can I change the context around me? And he would it's less like manualized for him. It's just like, how can I go back and forth between acknowledging what my views are, what my beliefs are, what I'm doing, the context around me, to what are possibilities to change it. So kind of a back and forth there. All right, now it's shifting to technique. So I'm going to go back to Insoo Berg's kind of end of session process in just a moment, but she really emphasized questions. She had lots of questions. And in her demonstration video, she kind of talks about like, I have lots of questions, lots of kind of odd questions for you. She'd say that to the family, but she really emphasized the miracle question. So it's basically, the miracle question it's on page 334. of the Gladding text, but it's basically the idea of like, suppose tomorrow you go to bed tonight and there is some sort of miracle, a miracle occurs, but you don't know that it occurred. So you wake up and you don't even know that a miracle occurred. Like, what's the very first thing that you would notice that would start to let you know that something's different? So that miracle question really starts to get into how life would be different on a better day, on that miracle day. But once again, it's really important that the client, that it's stated that, but you don't know it's happened yet. That helps the client start to notice, what are the small things in my day that would be different. So for some families that are really arguing and fighting a lot, it'd just be maybe they have a nice conversation, maybe they eat breakfast together, maybe that they're feeling less tension in the house, and people are they look at each other in the eye, or they smile at each other, whatever it is for the family. So kind of, once again, the emphasis is getting on it starts to focus on what are potential solutions. What if, how can the family act as if, the problems are resolved? Because once again, if it's a social construction, they can choose to construct their lives in a different way according to solutions. Okay, also the idea is really emphasized of exceptions. I talked about that a little bit, but exception finding is really important. So if the family says, oh, we always do this, it's like, okay, do you always, or is there maybe one time or a couple times where that doesn't occur? So, where maybe they say they always fight around dinner or at the dinner table. Like, well, is there a time when you had a nice dinner and there wasn't any fighting? Oh yeah, I guess there was a couple of weeks ago. Okay, what is it about that? So once again, the focus being directed towards an opportunity, where they've already been successful, where they've already demonstrated strengths, and emphasizing that and exploring that to really make sense of what was different there. So yeah, I guess I kind of mentioned that strengths are really emphasized. This is a strengths-based approach. Scaling questions are also used, so scaling, like, if a, Insoo Berg talked about, if a 10 is, you don't need to see me anymore, you've resolved your challenges and you found the solutions that you need. And a 1 is like how you felt when you called in because you didn't know what to do to work, to come into counseling because you were kind of at a loss of what to do. Where are you today? So if the family says, I'm at a 3. Okay, so what does that 3 mean? Okay, what would it be like to move to a 4? What would be different at a 4? So once again, you're trying to find what are the solutions, the small steps to get you to that change. Compliments are used, especially in Insoo Berg's approach, as well as homework. So Insoo Berg would take like a moment away from the family to kind of just think about it. And this is the end of session process. She would just basically write or kind of construct a message for the family that compliments all of them, that sees their strengths, that sees the good things that they're already doing and the good intentions that they already have. And then she would try to kind of acknowledge and validate the challenges that they're facing, or the circumstance that's hard for them. And then she'd kind of start to bridge then. So with talking about the strengths, talking about acknowledging and validating the challenges, then she would bridge that to a task, a homework task for the family. And for the one family that she's demonstrated with, that's in a demonstration video, it talks about how she just said, choose one day where you're going to act like, so if you're at a 3 today on that 1 to 10 scale that I just talked about, if the client's at a 3 and they've kind of decided here's what would be different at a 4. So Insoo kind of basically said, act as if you're at a 4 that day. Act from that place. No matter what anyone else does, choose a day. Don't tell anyone what day it is, and just choose that day to be your 4 day instead of a 3. So that's an example of a homework idea. So the shifting to the role of the counselor in this approach it seems to be a co-creative role, a co-constructor, co-builder for this client, to rebuild and re-emphasize and reorient them to a solution-based view and a strengths-based view of what's working well. What solutions are already there? What solutions does the client already possess inside them? I think that's a core belief of, individuals from this approach, is like, there's already resources inside of the individual and I just have to help them access it. So they help reframe towards solutions. I would see them as a change and a solution advocate. But also, Bill O'Hanlon talked about how he's always planting seeds towards solutions, seeds towards possibilities. So I think it's almost like they're a planter or a spark in the family to spark towards, positive I guess positive is not the right word, but a solution oriented way. So these are just some of the overarching, ideas on the techniques, the roles, and kind of the core constructs and way of conceptualizing the counseling process for these two approaches. So yeah, thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions.